Okay, so I posted a video yesterday talking about the relationship between living together before you're married and higher divorce rates. And Jonah's Opinions left a really great comment basically asking for more information or why I think this is actually the case and more details on the research behind this. And so I just wanted to make a follow-up video to answer Jonah's question. So first off, basically since the 1970s, when social scientists first started studying cohabitating before marriage, because the 70s is when that started to get a little bit more common, the general consensus has been that cohabitating before you get married leads to a greater chance of divorce. However, there are some researchers over the past couple of decades who have been trying to argue that this is no longer the case, basically saying that because cohabitation is so much more common now, that it doesn't necessarily predict greater divorce rates anymore. But a really interesting study came out in 2018. It was published in the Journal of Marriage and Family that showed that this trend still exists, that people who live together before they get married, and especially if they're not engaged yet, are more likely to get divorced later. But before I jump into this study's findings and also some of the reasons that social scientists think there's this relationship between living together before you're married and greater divorce, I just want to say that I know a lot of people are really frustrated with psychological and sociological research, and understandably so, because a lot of this research is correlational, which means that it just looks at relationships between variables that you can't necessarily draw a causal link between. So for example, all of this research that I'm talking about can't be used to prove that living together before marriage is going to make you get divorced. Basically, the only research that allows you to draw causal links are controlled experiments. But the problem with that, especially when it comes to studying relationships between people, is that we can't really ethically design controlled experiments that could result in some people's relationships ending later. Basically, no institutional review board is ever going to accept that, and no scientist is ever going to get grant funding for creating an experiment that could really mess with people's relationships and force people to do certain things like live together before marriage or not live together before marriage that they just wouldn't normally do over a long period of time. It's totally unethical. So if we're going to consider social science research at all, we have to be willing to work with these correlational studies. Okay, so back to that 2018 study. So the really interesting finding from this study was that they did a review of other research that was saying there's no longer a relationship between cohabitation and higher divorce rates, and showed that those other studies basically just didn't track the couples long enough, that they did not wait long enough through the marriage with the couples to see if they were going to get divorced later, that a lot of those couples ended up getting divorced, but it was after the studies were already published. In addition to that, this study also showed that the papers that were published showing that there was a lower chance of divorce after cohabitation were actually only looking at the first year post-marriage. So basically, it looks like people who live together before they get married end up having a lower chance of divorce in the first year, but then have a higher chance of divorce after the first year. So let's talk about causes now. So there are basically three main theories in this family studies field that try to explain why people who live together before marriage end up getting divorced more frequently. So the first one is that people who live together before marriage are actually already more likely to divorce independent of whether they had lived together or not. So for example, it's very well known that people who are in worse economic situations are more likely to divorce later, but they're also more likely to live together before they're married. In addition to that, we could speculate that people who choose to live together before marriage already don't really take marriage that seriously and kind of just see it as a piece of paper or, a legal contract that can be broken. And so they, going into living together, they're already, even if they decide to get married, they're already thinking marriage is not that big of a deal. The second theory here is that living together before you're married actually changes your attitude towards marriage, meaning that for people before they live together, maybe they take marriage a lot more seriously. And then after they live together, they think, we're basically already married, we're already doing life together. And then their attitude about marriage becomes more of what I was saying before, where it's kind of just, a piece of paper. It's just a contract. It's not that big of a deal. How is it that much different than what we're already doing? And then they end up getting married later because it seems like the normal thing to do after you've lived together for a while. But that change to just living together, then married, is not that important to them. So then divorce ends up being not as big of a deal either. Because if you don't take marriage super seriously, then divorce also is not taken that seriously. The third theory is that living together, especially if you live together for, many months and years, makes it a lot harder to break up, even if you don't think you guys should be together for the rest of your life. So once you move in together, you're not just sharing a space, but you're sharing a rent or a mortgage. You're maybe even already sharing children, and you've built this whole life together. So it becomes very logistically and emotionally hard to end that relationship. And so a lot of people might just get married because they think, oh, maybe that'll make it better, or I'm kind of have put myself in this position that that's the natural next step. And I don't think I should be married to this person, but it'd be a lot harder to break up at this point. I also want to add one additional theory that is not mentioned as much in the literature, but that I think is really relevant based on the couples that I've worked with as a marriage therapist, and that is the idea of intentionality in our choices. That a lot of people these days seem to kind of slide from one decision, one phase of life into the next one. That most of us go to college because that's kind of what everyone does, and it seems like what you're supposed to do. And then we get jobs in our majors that everybody else wants, or kind of just whatever we can get without much intentionality behind why we're doing what we're doing. And that happens a lot in relationships too. And so if we have been dating someone for a while, say since college or something like that, and then we end up getting married to them because that seems like the normal thing to do, or that's just the natural next step, that not being intentional and very thoughtful in our choices ends up with us making worse choices later, and then we suffer real consequences in the future as a result of not being intentional enough from the get-go. But at the end of the day, whatever the reasons are for this relationship between cohabitating and higher divorce rates, probably a mixture of things, it really boils down to, who do you want to be taking advice from? Do you want to take advice from people who got divorced or people who stayed together for life? Do you want to be modeling your life after people whose marriage ended, or people who are still happily married to this day? Honestly, if we want to stay married for life, I don't know why we wouldn't want to model our lives after the people who were able to achieve that goal of ours. But it sounds like my son maybe just woke up. Jonah, I hope that answered your question. Guys, please let me know what you think about this in the comments.